Good evening and welcome to tonight's live program. I'm Erin Greenwald, Vice President of Public Programs and Editor-in-Chief of 64 Parishes magazine at the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Tonight's conversation with Joshua Rothman is being recorded and streamed live here on Zoom webinar, as well as on Facebook Live, which means that only the people visible on screen will be the presenters. The only people visible on screen will be the presenters. If during the conversation you have a question you'd like answered during the question and answer period, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat window. The Q&A icon is located just at the bottom of the screen and you can type your question there. We've reserved 15 minutes at the end of the conversation for audience questions. And now I'm delighted to welcome our guest for this evening's program, Dr. Joshua Rothman, who is Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History at the University of Alabama. His newest book, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America, was published just last month, by Basic Books, and is the topic of tonight's conversation. He's the author of two previous books, Notorious in the Neighborhood, Sex and Families Across the Color Line in Virginia from 1787 to 1861, and Flush Times and Fever Dreams, a story of capitalism and slavery in the age of Jackson. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you, Erin. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. You know, I think we first met back in 2015 when the Historic New Orleans Collection had put together with the Library of Virginia the To Be Sold Symposium. And that kind of touched off a series of programs and exhibitions in both Virginia, in the Upper South, and here in New Orleans. And at that point, I believe you had already started researching the Ledger and the Chain. Is that right?
Yeah, that was pretty early on in the game. But yes, I was sort of getting the lay of the land for the research and trying to figure out what this book was going to look like and how I wanted to tackle the research for it. Yeah.
Well, you know, it just came out, was it April 20th? So it hasn't been out for very long. For those in the audience who have not quite read the book yet or haven't finished it, can you give us a brief outline of the book?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just take a couple of minutes if that's okay. And thank you for having me, and thanks to the LEH for having me, and thanks to everybody on the Zoom. I will try to be sort of brief because I want to make sure that we have time to talk. The Ledger and the Chain traces the lives and careers of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, who were the most important domestic slave traders in American history. And by the domestic slave trade, what I mean by that is the buying and selling of enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States. This kind of trade, the domestic trade, actually, of course, predates the United States itself, but it really takes off in the 19th century as the nation expands into what was then the Southwest, as white farmers flock there to capitalize on Indian dispossession and the growth of the cotton economy, and as the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade took hold in 1808, which left those farmers, if they wanted enslaved laborers legally, they had no choice but to acquire them domestically. And slave traders feed this demand. And no one played a bigger role in the slave trade industry than the men at the center of the book. Through their company, which was commonly known as Franklin and Armfield, they trafficked roughly 10,000 enslaved people from the Upper South, particularly from Maryland and Virginia, to the Lower South, particularly to Louisiana and Mississippi. And they did it really fast. The company was founded in 1828. It effectively stopped dealing in human beings in 1836. And yet, in that relatively short window, Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard transformed the domestic slave trade. They turn it from something that white men might do in a short-term quest for extra money, and they turned it into a profession, a big business, something that could yield enormous wealth for its operators. And in doing that, they created a business model for the slave trade that other traders would follow and build upon for decades afterward. But obviously their impact goes beyond just the slave trade business itself. By selling the labor, the asset values, the bodies of enslaved people, slave traders made possible the expansion of the cotton and sugar economies. And the cotton economy in particular, it sits at not only at the heart of the Southern economic growth, but of American economic growth before the Civil War. And the capital that is then extracted from the enslaved as they were bought and trafficked and sold and forced to labor, that capital then circulates throughout the entire country and ultimately across the Atlantic Ocean as well. And of course, slave traders in the slave trade absolutely ravaged the families and the communities of enslaved people who fell victim to it. And the numbers involved there are really, they're enormous. Between 1800 and 1860, roughly 1 million enslaved people were forcibly migrated across state lines. At least twice as many were bought and sold within the boundaries of individual states. When you add it all up, an enslaved person was sold somewhere in the United States roughly every 3.5 minutes for decades. And the book uses the stories of Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard to trace the broader ebbs and flows of this trade over time. It watches it grow and expand in the early 19th century. It watches it sort of stagger under the blows of financial disruptions and then rise up again out of the Depression, only to become practically as big as it had ever been by the outbreak of the Civil War that finally brought it to a close. So that's kind of an overview of what the book does. It covers a lot of the history of slavery, of the slave trade, of its relationship to the American economy. It tells the story of several men in particular and their business that were central to all of those histories. And I don't think it'll be a surprise that I tell you that it's a hard history to deal with. But among the hardest things, I think, is that the book demonstrates that neither the slave trade nor slave traders ever really suffered for the criticism they faced from the small number of American anti-slavery activists. In fact, the opposite was true. They flourished, both socially and economically. We do sometimes hear ideas to the contrary, and that's because white Americans said things to the contrary about the trade, about slave traders. They said it at the time. They said it for more than a century after the Civil War was over. But those ideas are mostly myths. And the fact that they are myths, the fact that the slave trade was a ubiquitous, profitable, widely accepted part of American life before the Civil War, the fact that slave traders could be understood as respectable businessmen who were important players in American development, all of that, I think, says some pretty uncomfortable things about the history of the United States. But there are things I think we need to face squarely, and that I hope the book helps us learn how to start grappling with. So that's my spiel.
I think it really does. And we're going to get into the question of the interconnected nature of the economics and the economy of the United States and the slave trade a little bit later on. But I wonder if you could provide a little bit of additional context for everyone tuning in. This is a book about human trafficking. And as you said, it's a book about the domestic slave trade. And I wonder if you could put the domestic slave trade into perspective by giving us a sense of the earlier transatlantic trade. Where does the volume of men, women, and children trafficked during this period compare to Africans brought forcibly to this country and its colonial antecedents?
Sure. So the transatlantic slave trade, existed for centuries before the United States ever came into being. It really gets started in the 15th century. It grows over the course of time. It really peaks around the time of the American Revolution. It grows very substantially in the 18th century. And, ultimately, I think the estimates are about 12 million people are taken into slavery in Africa for the purpose of being transported across the Atlantic Ocean and to be sent into forced labor in the Americas. The British North American colonies that become the United States, in the grand scheme of the transatlantic trade, are actually relatively small players. The bulk of people transported in the transatlantic trade are sent to the Caribbean and Brazil. All told, the best estimates I've seen suggest that between about 400,000 and 500,000 people were forcibly imported from Africa into the British North American colonies. And so, and that's not a small number, obviously. But relative to the domestic trade, even if you're just including people trafficked across state lines, it's double what the volume of the transatlantic trade was.
And it's
double,
period.
right? It's double in 6 or 7 decades as opposed to 200 years. So the intensity of it and the numbers of it are actually much more dramatic, at least for the United States. Other parts of the Western Hemisphere are obviously different.
And why was it important for you to write this particular book? And I mean that kind of psychologically, but also in terms of you went with a trade publisher, you went with Basic Books, you didn't go with a university press, and there are implications for that. And I wonder how you came to want to write this book in the way that it is written.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So writing it the way that it's written is actually easier for me to answer, but I'll do it second. You know, I like a lot of books, I started writing this book not really fully understanding what it was going to be. And it really wasn't until I got into the research that I understood kind of the stakes involved with it, the real context for the story that I wanted to tell. I knew I wanted to write about Franklin and Armfield. You know, material about the slave trade was something that was really important for my last book, which was about the growth of the Cotton South. When I was thinking about my next project, you know, there'd been a lot of literature in the last 15, 20 years about the slave trade, but I felt very little about slave traders. I just didn't understand who they were, where they came from, why did they do what they do. And I felt like that was sort of a spot in the literature that was missing, and they were questions that were worth asking. Franklin and Armfield, if you read about the domestic slave trade, you pretty much can't read about the domestic slave trade without coming across that name somewhere. But other than these kind of pocket biographies of who the partners were, other than these sort of very kind of broad and general descriptions of what the firm did and why it was important, there really wasn't a lot of work on it. There really wasn't anyone other than, you know, there'd been bits and pieces of it here and there. People had tackled it in parts, but nobody had ever settled down and say, okay, what is Franklin and Armfield? Who are these people? Where do they come from? How do they do what they do? Why did they become as successful as they become? What are the implications for the people that they traffic? And so that's kind of what got me into the book. I thought it was important. It was a missing spot in the literature. I thought it was a question that I personally wanted to know the answer to. But the more I got into it and the more I started writing it, the more I realized that the book was much bigger than the biographies of the partners, although that is the core of the book. It's much bigger than this particular company, although that is also the other part of the core of the book. This was really the story of the domestic slave trade itself. The lifespans of these partners runs from the 1780s into the 1870s. Their involvement in the trade predates their involvement in their company together, and the implications of it play out long past they're gone, the time that they're gone. It plays out long past, you know, the time some of them die. And so that's sort of why I wanted to write the book, and it became something other than what I thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. Why I wanted to do it with a trade press, and why I wrote it the way that I did, is that I think it's a story that in some ways is actually more important for a popular audience to read than for a scholarly audience. Right. I do think that it has a role to play in the scholarship and in the literature, and I hope that a lot of scholars will read it and get something out of it, and I think they will. But one thing that I discovered over the course of researching and writing this book is how little the domestic people sort of outside the academy really know about the domestic slave trade. Right. I think that you know, I think most people sort of understand intuitively that there was one, but I can't tell you how many times I would tell people what I was working on and people would immediately start asking me about Africa. And sure. It was clear to me right away that when they think slave trade, that's what they're thinking. And that, of course, is important. And I'm glad that they at least think in those terms. But when I would explain sort of what the book was really about, you could see a light bulb go on immediately and be like, oh, right, of course. But that sort of missing element of sort of popular knowledge, that missing element of the significance and the scope and the size of the trade in American life before the Civil War, I think, not for everyone, obviously, but I think for a lot of people, is sort of it's a blank spot in their knowledge. And I really think that it's the slave trade is in some ways exemplary of what slavery really was and what really made it work. It's not, obviously, farms and plantations are in some ways the engine of American economic development and of American slavery. But without the slave trade, those things don't happen. You need the movement of people. You need sort of the injection and the circulation of capital throughout the economy. You need the dynamism of a labor force in order to bring those things into being. And you need to make the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people a regular part of American life in order to make this work. And so I think that's an important story to tell. I thought it was valuable to bring it to a trade press. My natural writing style, I think, is more narrative than it is sort of theoretical or sort of deeply analytical. And so I felt like I was in a good place to tell that story. So that's the answer.
I would agree with that. And let's talk for a minute about the slave trade itself. You describe Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard as having revolutionized the slave trade. What do you mean by that? What did the slave trade look like before they, quote unquote, revolutionized the trade? And how did it look differently afterwards?
So the very early 19th century, and really the late 18th century too, the slave trade it existed. It has it's developing, but, until you get things like the Cotton Gin, until you get things like Louisiana Purchase, until you get Indian dispossession and displacement, until you get a kind of mature banking system that can actually sort of move capital more efficiently, the slave trade tended to be something that white men would get into kind of here and there. They do it for a year, maybe two. They're moving relatively small numbers of people. The money involved, at least in the big picture, the money involved is relatively small. And they tended to be itinerant, right? They would work out of bars and taverns and hotels. They'd show up at a town somewhere. Maybe they'd put an ad in the newspaper for a week or two. They would collect a few dozen people and then they'd be gone. And maybe you'd see them again the next year. Maybe you wouldn't. And the same thing happened at the sales end. Wherever they happened to be bringing people to, they'd show up, they'd come out of nowhere. They'd set up shop again in like a bar or a tavern. They'd make it known they had people for sale. And then once their business was done, they were gone. What Franklin and Armfield do, and they're not the pioneers exactly in this, right? There are other traders, and as I talk about in the book, particularly a man named Austin Woolfolk, who worked out of Maryland, who sort of really pioneered the model that Franklin and Armfield would then build upon. But what they really do is they are able to establish the slave trade as a profession, right? Not just something you might do, but as your job. That is your business. That is your career. You're going to do it for the long haul. You're going to do it in very large numbers. You're going to do it by establishing ongoing connections to merchants and to banks and to planters. You're going to have a regular headquarters, right? So customers, both at the purchase end and the sales end, they not only knew where you were all the time, but they felt that they could rely on you. They felt that this was a businessman as opposed to just some guy in a bar. And so that's something that really completely changes the way the slave trade operates in terms of its scale, in terms of sort of how it functions relative to other industries like banking and planting, in terms of its visibility in American cities, right? I mean, Franklin and Armfield, they have a storefront. And this is something that as they get going and as they demonstrate that this works, and then even after they get out, right, into the 1830s, 40s, 50s, this is how big players in the slave trade would operate for the rest of the period of American slavery. You really didn't see businesses like that too much before Franklin and Armfield, but afterward, you saw it all the time.
What do these changes mean for enslaved people in places like Virginia and Maryland?
It's absolutely devastating. Absolutely devastating. You know, and really people like Franklin and Armfield, what they are doing is they are capitalizing on much larger structural changes that are taking place, right? You have, like I said, the growth of the cotton economy, the landscape on which to do it, the banking money that is pouring into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana in order to bring this into being. And you have a declining economy in the Chesapeake, where you have slaveholders who have decided that they don't need as many enslaved people as they once did. They sometimes need money, and they are willing to sell people who they now imagine as surplus. They're willing to put those people on the market, and it's absolutely devastating. I mean, by I think that the estimates are that, you know, an adult enslaved a young adult enslaved person in the Upper South stood a 1 in 3 chance of being sold. You know, I remember there's one scholar who's talking about Austin Woolfolk, right? And one thing that Austin Woolfolk and Franklin and Armfield both did is they would have these armies of agents who would go out into the countryside, right? Employees, basically, who they would give money to. And these guys would go out and they'd cover tens of thousands of miles of the Upper South, just scooping up people and funneling them into these headquarters for shipment further south. And there's one scholar who was talking about Austin Woolfolk's operation, and he compares it to a logging operation. They would just come in and they would just clear cut the whole landscape. It's the kinds of impact that it has on enslaved families, on enslaved communities. It's almost literally unfathomable, right? The numbers are one thing, but to actually imagine what that is like subjectively, and we do have the testimony of a fair number of enslaved people who will tell you what it's like subjectively. But the truth is, I think that you know, William Wells Brown, who both was himself bought and sold and worked for a time for a slave trader, not willingly. You know, he eventually becomes one of the leading abolitionists in the United States. He becomes a playwright, a novelist, a historian. And he famously said, look, there's no way to describe American slavery. It can never really be described. And I think he's right. I think ultimately we can only get so close to what that experience was like. But the contours of it that we are able to tease out are they're immense.
Yeah, I mean, in reading your book, I thought that a good partner book is Heather Andrea Williams's Help Me to Find My People.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because she really, and both of you talk about it must have been a decimation of communities in the Upper South. I think about the people left behind.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about in the 1830s, after the federal government sanctioned Indian removal in the Southeast, in places like Georgia and the Carolinas, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, etc., that federal deportation of the Choctaw and the Chickasaw peoples yielded 18 million acres of land in Mississippi for white settlement. Mm-hmm. And that number, that 18 million acres, was more than half of the total acreage of the entire state of Mississippi.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, thinking about,
and it's in a very short period of time,
very
right?
Very short period
maybe
of time.
A 5-year period. All of a sudden, all of this land that, you know, pressure was being put on Native Americans for a very long time. And there are white people who settle in those places anyway, but it's effectively opening up half the state of Mississippi, which possesses some of the best cotton land on the continent. The federal government takes it from Native Americans, expels them from the land, mm-hmm. then turns around and sells it on the cheap to white planters, and then uses the money that they take in, right, which goes right to the federal treasury and goes into the second bank of the United States. The money is then invested in the cotton economy. So it's a theft of land that is then put into a theft of people in order to feed the American government. The cycle of it is absolutely incredible, and the speed with which it happens is just astonishing.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. You know, in that same section of the book, you talk about the population of enslaved people living in Mississippi in that same 1830s decade growing by nearly 200%.
Mm-hmm.
That just in the span of 10 years.
There are certain counties where it grows much faster.
So we're talking about 100,000 people in 10 years being brought.
Yeah, I think that's the number. It might be more than that.
Into Mississippi.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. And I think, you know, what you said about William Wells Brown saying you can never really understand American slavery, I think you've woven the testimonies of enslaved and free people who were witness to and subject to the activities of Franklin and Armfield. But you also say at one point that the degradation of Black personhood and the dismissal of Black emotions by white American society is a central part in the maintenance of American slavery. This kind of, we're talking about people and numbers and the credit economy, but these are mothers and fathers and neighbors and grandmothers, mm-hmm. and their communities are being shattered. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by this idea of the degradation of Black personhood and dismissal of Black emotions as being a central part in helping the American system maintain slavery? And also, does that historic degradation have lasting legacies?
So, yes, I can answer it. And yes, I think it does. You know, I'm glad that you noticed that the attention that I try to pay in the book to the testimony of enslaved people. I thought it was absolutely critical that even though that is not the center of the story, that be a constant reminder to the reader, right? That you can't get very far in this book before you're reminded of that again and again and again and again. And I thought that was very important. So I'm glad that comes through. What I mean about the dismissal of Black emotion and degradation of Black personhood, right? Part of the conundrum that I'm trying to figure out in this book is, you know, to be a slave holder is one thing. To be a slave trader in some ways it's not a completely different thing. I wouldn't push it that far, but it is a different thing because you're engaged in the buying and selling of people, not only as a business, but it's something you had to get up and do every single day for years. And you make a choice to do that. None of these people had to do it, right? Franklin, Armfield, Ballard, all these slave traders, you know, there's no point in which they cannot wake up one day and say, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. But they don't, right? They decide every day, I'm going to do this. This is something that I'm good at and that I like doing. And I had to try to get my mind around how could you do that, right? Because not only are you doing that, but you're staring in the face the kind of the pain and the suffering, the worst nightmares of enslaved people. You're looking at it every day in a way that slaveholders don't have to, really. They're sometimes confronted with that, but they could look the other way. You can't do that if you're a slave trader. And I don't think I ever really came to terms entirely with how a person could do that, because I don't actually know, right? Personally. I don't know how you do that. But I do know that one theme that emerged over and over and over again, both from Franklin and Armfield's writings and sometimes from commentary from people beyond the slave trade, was that, you know, I don't think it's true that white Americans actually thought enslaved people were not people. Right? There's this idea somehow that like, oh, well, enslaved people are property and that's how white people think of them. I don't believe that at all. They understood and believed they could treat them as property, but that's not the same thing as believing they are property. They know that Black people are people. They just don't care. That's what became clear to me over and over and over again. They didn't think that Black people's suffering, the pain that they saw, the the humanity of Black people, right? That they have families and loves and cares and joys and things that they like to do, things that they're talented at that don't have to do with labor. They don't think those things matter. And that's one, if you can do that, right? If that's your mindset, then a lot of the other stuff can fall into place.
Right.
And yeah, and I do think it has lasting impacts. I think we see sort of traces of it, and sometimes more than traces of it, every day and everywhere. I mean, you can take any number of metrics of how American society works. You know, but as long as we're sticking to things like pain and suffering, just take American healthcare, right? We know that statistically and anecdotally and studies and empirically that doctors do not take Black people's complaints of pain as seriously as they do white people's. They will not give them the kind of treatment that they give white people. They dismiss the idea that what's happening to them is actually happening to them. That doesn't come out of nowhere. That's the legacy of this kind of thing, and that's only one area of American life. I think we see it all the time.
Agreed. Obviously, I think the most recent and visible examples are in unequal treatment by police.
Of course.
That, you know, and it's interesting to think about the role that the police have played historically in the slave trade and in slavery. And, you know, you talk about the role of sheriffs and jailers. Mm-hmm. You also talk at length about financial institutions. And I think one of the many strengths of this book is you make very clear how bound up Franklin and Armfield's success was with that broader network of interests, particularly financial interests that benefited and enabled the slave trade. Can you talk about the interconnected growth of the slave trade and American financial institutions?
Sure. So part of what makes Franklin and Armfield so successful, and part of what they do that I think is, I don't know if it really sets them apart from people like Austin Woolfolk, because I suspect Austin Woolfolk did some of these things too, but they do it much more systematically and much bigger, is that what makes their business model work is that, you know, most slave traders prefer to operate on a cash business, right? When they're purchasing people in the Upper South, they're making purchases with cash, because a slaveholder is not going to, you know, sell you a person on credit and just expect that you're going to come back, right? They know you're not going to come back.
You could buy enslaved people on credit?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second, right?
Right.
So in the Upper South, the purchasing end is almost an entirely cash business. The sales end, however, is a little different. The sales end, most slave traders preferred cash. Itinerant slave traders in particular usually would only work on cash, right? Because they don't want to come back and collect debts. But big operators like Franklin and Armfield, if they're in a place like Natchez or New Orleans all year round, if they are reliable business people and they're dealing with merchants and planters and bankers who are also consider themselves reliable business people and who value the integrity of their credit, a lot of times slaveholders and merchants, they may not have the cash available, or they may prefer to use cash for something else, but still want enslaved laborers. So Franklin and Armfield are willing to extend them credit. They'll basically say, okay, well, you know, you can, I will sell you half a dozen enslaved people, and here's the purchase price, and you can pay me in a year with 10% interest. Or I'll take a note. I'll take a note from your merchant, right? That says your merchant is good for it. And that will be sort of your security, right? Mm-hmm. If you're just buying it on straight credit, sometimes the enslaved people themselves are the security, right? So if you don't pay up, then the slave trader is going to go and collect that person back from you. You're basically sort of mortgaging the enslaved person to finance their own sale, right? And so some of what makes Franklin and Armfield work is they do a lot of credit sales if they have to. Planters preferred it. They don't like paying the money up front if they don't have to. It gives Franklin and Armfield leverage on smaller traders, because if a planter says, okay, I can pay cash now or credit later, I'll go with credit. I'll pay later, right? And so smaller traders who can only deal in cash can't compete with Franklin and Armfield. Now, here's the other side of it, though, and here's where the banking comes into play, which is that Franklin and Armfield do have a lot of cash on hand that they're using, but there comes a point where if you extend so much credit, then you don't have money to send back to John Armfield and Rice Ballard in Virginia to keep buying people, right? Because you've got to have that kind of circulation going, right? You've got to have money coming in that you can then send back to buy more people. But you can get more money if you have credit lines with banks. And that is what Franklin is kind of a genius at, right? He had been operating in the Lower South, particularly in Natchez, but also in New Orleans, for 20 years by the time he and John Armfield create the company together. And so he has these established business connections going on 2 decades by that point. People knew who he was. They knew he was reliable. And so banks would extend him credit. So he would brag, particularly when financial hard times came around, he would brag that like he could get $1 when no one could get $1. And so financial institutions, they see money coming in from slave traders. They want a piece of that action. Slave traders can get, ideally they could get good money, right? Because they're getting it from prominent merchants and planters, and money had different values before the Civil War. Not $1 is not the same dollar. And so, if you're a reliable business person and you can get access to that kind of money, you're going to have banks who are going to loan you money. And so Franklin can extend credit on one end. He's borrowing on the other end. He's collecting debts all the time. And so as long as you can keep that going, the money circulates all over the country, because what he would do is he would take money from banks in New Orleans and Natchez. He would send it to Virginia. There are often correspondent relationships with banks, not only in places like Richmond, but places like New York and Philadelphia. And he would say, look, go cash the checks that I'm sending you up in New York if you got the time. And so really the entire country's financial system is looped into this business, and often want a part of it.
I want to talk for a minute about something that happened recently in Louisiana, actually. And I think it's relevant to this conversation. Recently, we had a legislator from St. Bernard Parish, which is just outside of New Orleans, just on the other side of Orleans Parish line. And he introduced a bill that would have outlawed the teaching of what are called divisive concepts. This is in quotes. Divisive
a lot of that
concepts
going around. Yeah.
At all public educational institutions in the state. And this is from pre-kindergarten through graduate schools, if they're public educational institutions. And one of the concepts defined as divisive under the bill was any teaching that indicated that the state was in any way, quote, fundamentally, institutionally, or systematically racist or sexist. Now, the bill died in committee, not necessarily because of the substance of the bill, but because the legislator suggested in public that teachers should teach, quote, the good, the bad, and the ugly of slavery. I was struck in reading the ledger in the chain by the levels at which state, local, and municipal governments not only created legal environments that made people trafficking possible, but how those same governments benefited financially from the slave trade and from slavery itself. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's any number of ways in which that's true. Obviously, the federal government sanctions the slave trade. And what I mean by that is quite literally when the transatlantic slave trade is banned, the very same law that bans the transatlantic slave trade puts customs regulations in place for shipping people domestically, right? I mean, yes, you could walk people over land and there's pretty much no rules about that. But if you were going to ship people, which is Franklin Armfield do that mostly, they're putting people on boats in Alexandria and shipping them down the Atlantic into the Gulf of Mexico, up through the Belize into New Orleans. There are customs regulations for that. Right. So the federal government not only, I mean, saying they turn a blind eye to it doesn't cover it. They create laws to make sure that it was working properly. Another way the federal government sanctions it is that, you know, among the powers enumerated to Congress in the Constitution, right? And there's a lot of conflict and controversy over what Congress can really do and what it can't do. One thing it unambiguously can do is regulate interstate commerce.
Right. And
yet they never do anything about the domestic slave trade. It is quite clearly in Congress's purview to have done something about this had they had the votes for it and the will for it. They don't have either, and they never do anything about it. When you get down below the federal level to the state levels, states do periodically try putting in place bans on importing people for sale, right? Now, they never really put any restrictions on the ability of individual slaveholders to bring people into the state, right? So if you were in Louisiana and you wanted to go to Virginia and buy people and bring them back, you could do that. But Louisiana, like every state in the Deep South, periodically will try to say, well, slave traders can't bring their wares into the state. Now, there's nothing to do with the morals. It has to do with the fact that slave traders were bringing in, usually what the impetus for these laws is, they're bringing in too many people at once. They're bringing in people, sometimes it's a reaction to Nat Turner, and so there's fears of rebellion.
Right.
Slave traders are not only bringing in a lot of people, but when they make sales, they take capital out of the state, right? So these are the reasons these bans get put in place. They're never very effective. They're never in place for very long. Instead, usually what the state does and what municipalities do is they are capitalizing on this in different ways. The city of Natchez, for example, taxes slave sales, right? Now, whether they collect it all the time, that could be a tricky issue, but they do make money from it. The city of New Orleans eventually licenses slave traders. Richmond, Virginia licenses slave traders. Washington, D.C. licenses slave traders, right?
And there's a fee for the license.
Yeah, there's a fee, right? If you wanted to operate as a slave trader, you could do that, but you're going to have to pay some money to the city or the state. If you operated illegally and brought in people for sale illegally, the law was that those people would be confiscated, but the trader paid a fine, and that fine went to the state, and the people would be sold, and the money for that goes into the state treasury. The state of Virginia uses money from slave sales to finance the library fund. You know, they're paying for schools in part from this. And it really goes on and on and on like that. And sometimes the state is directly involved. You know, the state of Louisiana, for example, the Board of Public Works purchases several dozen enslaved people from Isaac Franklin to do work on the levees because it's dangerous work. They're not going to have white people do it. So they buy enslaved people and put them to work on the levees. So sometimes the state is not only making money from the slave trade, they are purchasing people from slave traders. So this, you know, and that doesn't even begin to get into, you know, sheriff sales and clerk's fees. And, you know, every time a slave sale happens, right, there's a notary in Louisiana who keeps track of it. There are fees. The notary gets a fee. The mortgage guy gets a fee. The clerks get a fee. It's like $5 or $6 or $8 for every slave sale. All of that money goes to the state. So, I mean, there's endless number of ways in which the state is institutionally and systematically involved in making money from the slave trade. And to suggest otherwise is just, I mean, it's not even an argument. It's just not true. It's just flat wrong.
It's not an argument, but I think it's something that very few people know much about.
Sure.
It's important. I think that the way that your book kind of exposes the underbelly and all of the different connections of the slave trade, it didn't operate in a vacuum. It was fully interconnected and enmeshed into the workings of the country in the antebellum period. You referenced free Black men and women being kidnapped and sold illegally into the slave trade. Sure. How common was this practice? Are there many examples of kidnapped men and women who were later able to kind of reestablish their freedom? It seemed by your book that it was more common than I had understood.
Yeah. You know, it's anecdotal though. So it's hard to tell. I would say that look, there are a couple of good books that have come out recently about the phenomenon of kidnapping, right? I mean, I think most Americans at this point are familiar with the story of Solomon Northup, right? Was probably the most famous example of this. And certainly until recently was the most famous example most historians even knew of. You know, but, you know, Richard Bell has a book out called Stolen, which talks about basically kidnapping rings that would operate in Maryland. Jonathan Daniel Wells has a book out called the Great Kidnapping Club, something Kidnapping Club, which is basically all about how you've got these sort of rings of criminals in New York City who are plucking Black people off the street and just sending them into slavery. And I think particularly in the Upper South, where you've got a border between Virginia and Pennsylvania, there's a lot of fluidity in there. You have cases of people who are so-called term slaves, where like there was a legal institution in place that said, you know, places where slavery was sort of being phased out, where you could say, okay, I'm going to keep this person enslaved till such and such a time, and then they're free. And sometimes people would just say, no, I'm just going to sell them instead. That's illegal. You can't do that. They did it anyway. And so I think, you know, I don't think we have solid numbers on it precisely because it's illegal, but there are hundreds, thousands of free people who are kidnapped and sold into slavery. And I think the numbers of them who managed to get out, people like Solomon Northup, who maybe could get a word back home. I've got a few instances in the book of people who ran, right? Who do manage to get out, and they manage to get back and tell their story. Those things do happen. There are cases, you know, where, I mean, I'll mention this in the book. It's maybe in a footnote, but, you know, where John Armfield, right, said all the time that he doesn't do that, right? He didn't deal in kidnapped people. He definitely dealt in kidnapped people. And, you know, but I do have one case where, you know, there's I can't remember if it's a newspaper story or a lawsuit where people will go to John Armfield and they say, look, you have this person in your custody who's a free person. And when he was caught dead to rights, he would say, oh, you know, I didn't know. And he would free the person, right? Because if the evidence is right there, he didn't want a reputation as being a kidnapper. But he surely dealt in kidnapped people. Every slave trader did. So yeah, I mean, I think the phenomena of people being kidnapped is much more widespread than we usually acknowledge, although I think we're starting to learn more and more about it. And I think the number of people who manage to get away, it happens. I think that most people don't. I think most people are kidnapped, sent into slavery, and there's not a lot of avenue for escape.
Right. It's not surprising. I just, you know, I was struck by the number of people and stories like Isaac Franklin being basically called out for having done that, kidnapped people, and then, you know, oops, no, didn't mean to do that.
Right.
Let's talk for a minute about Isaac Franklin's land holdings in Louisiana.
Sure.
He expanded his holdings in Louisiana after he exited the slave trade in the late 1830s. Very lucky for him, just before the collapse of the American economy in 1837.
Well, that's how he comes in. That's how he comes into all the land.
It's really, I mean, it's unfortunate that they were not ruined by the collapse of.
Oh no, they do great.
They do great. Can you tell us more about his properties in Louisiana and the people he enslaved here in the state? Yeah,
so Franklin's coming into all this property in Louisiana is sort of a strange story. You know, he basically gets involved in a land partnership with a guy named Frank Ruth, who's from a very prominent Natchez family that Franklin had done business with for years. And Frank Ruth was in way over his head in debt. He's expanding, he's accumulating different parcels of property over the course of the 1820s and the early 1830s in West Feliciana Parish. He's putting mortgage on top of mortgage on top of mortgage in order to accumulate more property and more people to labor on that property. But he realizes that around 1835, he's kind of been way over his head and he needs capital. So he gets Isaac Franklin to go into business with him, and Franklin puts up a whole bunch of money. And what Franklin was expecting was that he would put in a bunch of money, but not really do any work, right? He's expecting Frank Ruth to do the work, and Franklin's just going to be sort of a silent partner and make money. Well, then the Panic of 1837 comes around, right? Frank Ruth cannot get out from under his debts. All the property is going to be sold at auction. And the truth was, it's going to be sold for pennies on the dollar. Franklin was in a position where he was going to lose tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. So he buys it all himself. He's like, this is the only way to salvage this. And so that essentially is the beginning of how Franklin comes into what eventually got broken into a series of 6 plantations in West Feliciana Parish. 3 of them were in business that Frank Ruth actually carved up the land. 3 of them are properties that Franklin himself puts into operation. The most famous one of them, of course, was called Angola. And it is now the core of what is the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola. Franklin is still working on the property right up till the time he dies in 1846. He puts instructions in his will to bring several hundred more enslaved people on the property. By the time all is said and done, Franklin himself has about, I remember it's between 600 and 700 enslaved people on those 6 plantations. He's growing cotton. He is harvesting Spanish moss. He even thinks about experimenting with sugar growing.
There's a lumber mill, right? There's a lumber mill.
Yeah, he's got a lumber mill because basically he goes in as he clear cuts the plantation. He takes the wood and then turns that into lumber and, of course, sells that. And yeah, I mean, and that is sort of when he dies, that is really where the bulk of his wealth resides. I mean, he has a very large holding in Tennessee, where he's from, and he has about 125 enslaved people on that property. But the Louisiana properties is really, it's at least 2/3 of the value of what his estate is. And of course, his estate, the vast majority of the wealth in that estate is embodied in enslaved people. Their asset value is the bulk of his wealth. And that was true for every slaveholder. Any large slaveholder, most of their money is in enslaved people. They're worth more than the land.
Right. Well, we have time for one more question, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A. But sure. In the epilogue, you touched briefly on the relative obscurity of Franklin and Armfield. Does continued existence of sites tied to their legacies, sites like Angola, Louisiana, Forks of the Road in Natchez, Belmont Mansion, University of the South in Tennessee. Do you believe that marking the landscape in recognition of sites tied to American slavery and the slave trade is important? And why? If you do believe that marking sites of public memory, sites of conscience, if you will, why is that important? What function does something like that play in modern society?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's important, right? Because you and I,
right, but I have to ask the question.
Right, I know. But I mean, you and I work together to try to get markings of sites of the domestic slave trade put in place in the city of New Orleans. When I started working on this book, I was hardly the first person struck by this, but I was struck by how New Orleans was the largest site of the domestic slave trade in American history.
Right.
And yet the only real sort of place you would see that on the landscape was that sign that was purportedly the site of Pierre Maspero's, which was not Pierre Maspero's.
The wrong spot.
Right, in the wrong spot. I think by the time I started working on the book, there was a marker for Solomon Northup, and that was it. And so, I do think it's important. And I think it's particularly important in places where the most visible memories of the era of American slavery are monuments and markers to the Confederacy, right? I mean, that's sort of what's left over from American slavery. I mean, other than obviously, plantation houses, and those are problematic in different ways, but I'm just talking about cities, right? That was usually where you'd see things about American slavery. And I feel in the same way that the slave trade was so important and so visible at the time of American slavery to making it work, if we're actually going to remember slavery, and I don't think there's anyone, who's really dealing in good faith who would say that we should not remember slavery. then we need to remember the slave trade. If we don't, then I think we're left with an image of slavery that really is nothing but plantation houses and farms and cotton fields. And yeah, those things are important. But if you really wanted to see sort of slavery's working every day, you didn't see it on a plantation. Those were private property, right? If you were in a place like New Orleans in 1830, 1840, 1850, you saw slavery everywhere. And yet there's no sense of that visibility on the landscape anymore. And I think if we're going to properly, reckoning with slavery is a different issue, but I think as a predicate for starting to reckon with it, we need to acknowledge where it was, what you would have seen in a place like New Orleans. So yeah. I think it's absolutely critical.
I mean, you know that I agree with you. And I think one of the important things to remember about marking the landscape is people can't opt out. Mm-hmm. You know, the people who are in this audience tonight have chosen to come and attend this talk on your book, which focuses on human trafficking. But in the French Quarter, your average tourist, mm-hmm. they see a marker, and for many people, a historic marker has a certain gravitas mm-hmm. to it. And I think it's really important that we continue to mark these sites because they are able to reach a much broader swath of the American public because they're not opting in. You know,
I absolutely agree. I mean, we were able to put up about half a dozen markers, and I think most, if not all of them, are technically outside the French Quarter, right? Because that's how the slave trade operated, right? It was pushed into the Marigny, it was pushed into the CBD. Maybe there are some in the quarter.
There's three in the quarter. There's three. There's one on the St. Louis Hotel.
There is one on the St. Louis Hotel. Okay, I couldn't remember whether there was one.
It's on the remaining part, the very small part of the facade of the Royal Orleans that is extant to the St. Louis Hotel.
And I know there's ones down by the river.
There's ones down by the river. There's one in the 500 block of Royal, and there's one on the Cabildo because that was an important site for sheriff sales,
right, particularly in the early trade. Sales. Right. I remember that. Yeah. But look, we all know there's more of that. I mean, that's a great start. I'm not complaining at all.
No, there's more to be done though.
There was so much work that went into even getting those sites recognized. But I think we all know that there's so much more work that's still to be done, and so many more stories still to tell.
I think Forks of the Road is part of a major undertaking right now. I think it's like a 10-year plan by the National Park Service.
Yeah, I've been in some consultation with them about that.
Yeah, so that's long overdue. Yeah, that's long overdue. And I'm all hail Sir Boxley for pushing the citizens of Natchez for decades to recognize the importance of that site. So let's take a question from the audience. We have a question that says, in your book, you acknowledge speaking with the descendants, I assume, of Franklin Armfield and or Ballard, some of whom you met through a Facebook group. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about how receptive they were to your research? And did you have descendants who were not receptive to your research?
So that's a great question, a question I get all the time. So Franklin and Armfield, Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, neither one of them has direct living white descendants. Right. I know that at least one of them has at least one living Black descendant. Both of them may have living Black descendants. I don't actually know. Rice Ballard probably does have living white descendants. I did not track them down. I still haven't tracked them down. But he had 3 daughters who lived to adulthood, lived for a long time, and had families. And so I imagine he still has white descendants. But Franklin Armfield, John Armfield never had children with his wife. And Isaac Franklin has children with his wife, but none of them lived to adulthood. So the descendants that I have met are people who are either descended from relatives of Isaac Franklin. Well, they're all descended from relatives of Isaac Franklin, but some of them are relatives of John Armfield's wife, who was one of Isaac Franklin's nieces. And basically what they do is they raise some of Martha Armfield's nieces and nephews as their own children, right? So I know people who are descended from them. Mm-hmm. And when I came across the Facebook group, which I did really by accident, I was in the Tennessee State Library and I was just doing a Google search as people do when they do research on a project. You know, I Googled it. I came across this Facebook group, which is a group for descendants of Isaac Franklin's father, James Franklin Sr. And I emailed one of the administrators of the group. I had no idea what was going to come of it. I was a little wary of doing it, but I felt better about doing it than I did cold calling somebody on the phone.
Right.
Because look, she could have just ignored me, right? And that would have been okay, right? And that's sort of what I expected. But she didn't. She got back to me almost immediately. And really, you know, look, I'm sure that there are descendants who are, you know, want to keep this stuff at arm's length, who are not comfortable with it, who may well be outright hostile to the fact that I wrote this book in the first place. I have not met those people. The people that I have been in touch with, the people I've communicated with, have been welcoming to my work, have been, in some cases, have actively helped me, given me sort of access to, I mean, not like troves of papers and things. They don't seem to have that, but artifacts and whatever little bits and pieces of letters that they might have that you know, that maybe aren't in public domain. They've had conversations with me about sort of what this means to them and how they feel about it. And I think the answer how they feel about it, which is what everybody wants to know, is it's really complicated. I know that I don't like putting words in their mouth, but my sense has always been that they feel a real burden that this is the history that they were born into, right? Mm-hmm. It's not, I think it's oversimplifying it to say they feel guilty. Exactly. It happened long before they were born, but they do feel a responsibility. This is sort of the family they came from. This is where, to the extent that there's money in their families at all, you know, it can be traced back to these sorts of things. And it's a really, you know, I say it's complicated, not because they have mixed feelings about, you know, these particular ancestors, but they have mixed feelings about being descended from these ancestors and mixed feelings about what exactly they should do. I don't think they've quite sorted that out yet, but I do think that many of the ones I've talked to have made efforts toward reconciliation and toward reckoning that they think is absolutely critical, because they embody sort of what's left of this generations later.
And, you know, just thinking about Isaac Franklin owning 630 some people at the end of his life, there must be tens of thousands of descendants of people owned by him. And then I can't even imagine people who are descended of those who were sold.
I mean, if you pull in the numbers of the descendants of the numbers of people he personally enslaved and the numbers of people that the company sold, it's got to be at least 1 million people. It has to be. I mean, it's generations later, right? And those are people who I didn't track down in some ways because there are so many. Where would I start?
Right.
You know, I've seen people mention on social media or I've gotten an email or two here and there of people who know they are descended from people that Franklin enslaved or people who were sold by Franklin and Armfield. But the idea of trying to sort of get a sense of what that diaspora looks like, it's too much sort of for one person to get
monumental. Absolutely. Yeah. Someone's brought up a very good point, and that is that we've not really talked about New Orleans locations relative to not only Franklin and Armfield, but the slave trade. If you want to start by telling us where Franklin and Armfield operated out of here in New Orleans. I know there were 2 different locations, and what those properties looked like and the functions what were the roles of those properties? Yeah,
sure. So when Franklin and Armfield first start working in New Orleans, and like I said, Isaac Franklin was working in New Orleans with his older brothers, like in the first decade of the 19th century. And so very early in the 19th century, and really even in the early days of Franklin and Armfield as a company, Franklin, like a lot of slave traders, was probably working somewhere in the French court. That's sort of the core of the city proper was the French Quarter. The boundaries may have been technically slightly different, but that's basically it, right? It's Esplanade on the downriver side. It's Canal Street on the upriver side. It's maybe extended a little bit past Rampart back then. I can't remember, right? And it's the river. That's the city. And Franklin was operating probably in bars and taverns and sort of stashing people wherever he could. It's hard to get a sense of where kind of pens and compounds were in the quarter itself. From what we read, they were seemingly everywhere. You know, wherever you could stash people, slave traders were stashing people. He definitely would periodically hang out at Hewlett's Exchange, which is what became the St. Louis Hotel, which had been the Sparrows and then became Hewlett's and then becomes the St. Louis Hotel. And it's always sort of the heart of the slave trade. But there comes a point where the city of New Orleans passes a regulation that says, if you're going to operate as a slave trader, not as an auctioneer, auctioneers could keep working in the quarter, but slave traders themselves get pushed out of the French Quarter proper. Right. So you had to be on the downriver side of Esplanade or the upriver side of Canal. And those boundaries do change a little bit over time, but the downriver side pretty much stays the same. Mm-hmm. So what Franklin did is he just moved right to the Marigny side of Esplanade. I mean, he goes right across the neutral ground and is like, I'm outside the city, right?
Well, he wasn't alone.
Oh, no, not at all. He's in some ways, he goes there and then other people follow, you know, which is pretty typical for Franklin. I mean, that's how the Forks of the Road really gets going too. So the first spot he operates from is a spot at that weird triangle intersection of Esplanade and Frenchman, right? Where Frenchman sort of comes into Esplanade and there's that little triangular lot there, which has, I can't remember what, there's like a restaurant and bar right on the corner now. And then there's a hotel right up the street from there. And he basically has a house, and behind the house, there are several vacant lots. He probably puts up a fence or a wall, and he works there for a couple of years. And it's a perfect spot for a slave trader, right? It's right up the river. It's right up Esplanade from the levee, right? Which is where when Franklin and Armfield are shipping people, they're landing at the levee. Franklin picks them up. He got to walk them maybe a block and a half, and there they are. And that's his sales compounds right across the street from the city. Then there's a brief period where the state of Louisiana bans the slave trade. Franklin and Armfield, they cheat a little bit. They try to find ways around that ban, but there's a brief period where they decide it's not worth it. We'll just work out of Natchez. So they give up the lease on the place in Frenchman. But as soon as the slave trade opens back up again, Franklin comes back to New Orleans and rents a new place. And that place is at the intersection of Esplanade and Royal, which was then Casa Calvo when you get over to the Marigny side. It's a parking lot. That's what it is now. It's a parking lot. At the time, there was that property had originated as a naval hospital. And so there was already a wall around it. There were already a bunch of little outbuildings on the property. But basically, if you take the whole block from Esplanade along Royal back to what's now Caleric, which was then Peace Street, if I remember right. But it's that whole block from Esplanade to Caleric and from Royal sort of up the street a chunk. That is his compound. And he's operating from there for another couple of years until they shut down the business. And by that time, you know, from that point forward, that section of the Marigny is really a whole district of slave traders. You know, there's a point in the 1840s or 50s where there's 7 or 8 of them on a single block. Right. And the parallel to that, of course, is on the upriver side in the American sector, all along Canal Street. You know, you've got the St. Charles Hotel, which is a major site of the trade. Yeah, right. And then, you know, as you go up Canal, there's more and more sites there. So that's sort of where the slave trade kind of clusters in New Orleans for a really long time.
So we've talked about New Orleans. I think we've addressed that. The question of Forks of the Road has come up. Now, most of the people, am I correct, that Franklin and Armfield are bringing into New Orleans are being brought to New Orleans by ship, and often by ships that they own and operate.
That's right.
There was some of that at Natchez, lots of ships being sent further upriver to Natchez, but there were also people being brought over land to Natchez. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the trade of people being marched over very long distances from all sorts of places, particularly along the Natchez Trace.
Yeah. So that is probably the predominant way that enslaved people were trafficked in the domestic slave trade. It was certainly the way people were mostly trafficked within states, right? If they're only being sold and moved, 50, 100, 200 miles, only, right? They're usually being put in in a coffle. And that's sort of the familiar image that we have of the slave trade, of people in chains and handcuffs being walked two and two in these long lines. And Franklin and Armfield did some of that. And probably the slave trade as a whole, probably the bulk of it worked that way. Franklin and Armfield would march a coffle of people at the end of every summer. And basically what they're doing is they're trying to have a kind of supply in place when the trading season gets underway, right? They would clear out people they'd accumulated in the compound over the summer. Mm-hmm. They'd make room for more people who then they would follow up by ship, but it was too early to ship because you get there too fast, and you wouldn't have any customers. But if you spaced it out, right, and a coffle, if you're going to walk people from Alexandria, Virginia to Natchez, it takes a couple of months. So the timing would work that way. And so that's what they would do. And travelers reported seeing coffles of people all the time. The roads are just packed with enslaved people being forcibly marched across the continent. I mean, it's 1,200 miles, right? But Natchez is bringing in people in all sorts of ways, right? You've got people who are coming down the Natchez Trace, which basically runs from Nashville to Natchez, and you can still drive big portions of it. And Franklin and Armfield we think, use that route, right? They would walk people from Alexandria over to Nashville, and they would pass by Isaac Franklin's property along the way, which was just northeast of Nashville. And then they would go from Nashville down the Natchez Trace to Natchez. But you also have slave traders who are bringing people down the Mississippi River. They're coming by flatboat, sometimes by steamboat, right? Mm-hmm. And they're coming in and they're landing at the dock in Natchez that way. And you've got people coming up the river. So Franklin and Armfield, the bulk of their sales happen in Natchez. Probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the people they sell are sold in Natchez. Mm-hmm. I mean, they sell several thousand people in New Orleans too, but the core of their business is in Mississippi. Sure. And what they would do is they would send people by ship from Alexandria down the Atlantic coast, like I said, around the Gulf into New Orleans. If Franklin was doing business in New Orleans, sometimes he would sell some people there, and then he would put them on a steamboat, whoever was left or whoever he intended to move out of the city, and then they would go by steamboat up to Natchez that way. And so, I mean, Natchez is bringing in people from all different ways and all different directions. Yeah.
So we're going to end with a final question, and it's a doozy. And it's, I think we can talk a little bit about what reparations look like.
Yeah.
This is, we're talking about more than 3 million people at the end of the Civil War.
4 million.
Who are liberated. Mm-hmm. They've been cheated of their labors. They've had, in many instances, their families taken from them. They've had no ability to build intergenerational wealth. Mm-hmm. What does reparations look like? I think there are lots of different forms that it could take. What are your thoughts on what reparations could look like?
Yeah, so this is a question I also get a lot. And it's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer that really satisfies everybody. And I say that because I'm not a reparations scholar, right? Sure. There are lots of different ways to do this. There are lots of different ways to kind of calculate what reparations mean. Everything from, direct cash payments to investments in communities to, to revamping the way education works. There's all kinds of ways that reparations could work, right? And because I'm not a reparations scholar, and frankly, because I don't know the right answer, I don't know what I think about how reparations can work. But here's what I do know, and here's where I think the conversation, for me at least, needs to start. because I think in some ways the question of what does reparations look like, in some ways it's really easy to get from that question to the question of the practicality of it, right? People who are resistant to the idea, all of a sudden, if you say, well, we're going to do, you know, a wealth transfer, they're going to be like, well, how is that going to work? You know, if you're descendant, what if you're not descended from enslaved people? What if you're descended of an immigrant? What if you came after the Civil War? All these things. And to me, like, that's not like, yeah, you can get bogged down in that, but you're going to get bogged down in that. To me, though, this is the issue. And it gets back to how you phrase the question, which is the Civil War comes, enslaved people are then become free people. There have been hundreds of years of forced labor that is never compensated for. There is the trauma of family separation, of people who were murdered, people who died, never compensated for, justice never done. There's the asset value of enslaved people, right? Billions of dollars in 19th century money that not only does right, that asset value, people have been used not only as forced laborers, people have been used to be mortgaged. They've been used, you know, when banks make repossessions, that's property. That money, the enslaved people could be used to underwrite banks and state bonds, which is another sort of state form of wealth that we didn't talk about.
I think that happened here with the
Oh yeah, with the plantation banks, right? The Union Bank of Mississippi is underwritten by plantations and enslaved people.
Right.
All of that money that then spins off to the entire country, right? All of that money, white people kept all that. When enslaved people are emancipated, right? Each one of them goes from being worth a certain amount of money to now being a free person. Well, what about all that money that they were worth? Nobody paid them that, right? None of this ever happens. And so to me, the question is not, what do we do about it now? That is an important question. But the first thing that has to happen is we need to all be on the same page and understand not only what happened, but that was not right. That was profound injustice that was never made right. Never even an attempt, really, to make it right. And the country that we live in now is the same country as 1865. It's not like it's not the United States anymore. There's a direct through line. The country that made slavery is the country we live in now. That's a debt. And when you when somebody dies and an estate is passed on, the people who inherit the estate, they inherit the debt. But what's happened when it comes to slavery is the country just said, yeah, we're not going to pay the debt. We're just going to take the benefits. I think anyone who's being fair-minded at all would agree that that's just not right. That is profoundly unjust. And once we can agree on that, then you can get to the question of, okay, well, what do we do about it, right? But until we're on the same page about what exactly we're talking about, the practicalities of it is a distraction to me. But I think anyone who really believes in what they say American values are, right? You paid for your work, that you get to keep what you earn. If you really believe in those things, then you need to grapple with this, because that didn't happen.
Yeah, and I think despite not being a reparations scholar, that was very well put. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you so much, Josh, for the work that you've done, for what are probably going to be some sleepless nights as you continue talking to many, many people around the country about this incredibly difficult topic. I told you when we first got on the call that it was an emotionally difficult book for me to read. Incredibly important, very well written. Thank you so much for writing it. I wish you all the best, and I hope to see you soon.
Yes, I am hoping to make a to get out of my house and start making trips. And I'm hoping to get down to the city in July sometime. So I will let you know. I would love to see you.
All right. Be in touch.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I appreciate it.